Dizzy Gillespie had, over the course of the mid-1940s and into the 1950s, become the most articulate and the most publicly visible representative of the argument that jazz had moved on. The argument was not primarily about music, or rather, it was about music in the way that arguments about art often become arguments about identity, about what it means to be a serious artist in a particular moment, about what the past represents and what it requires of the present. Bebop, which Gillespie had helped develop alongside Charlie Parker and a small group of musicians in the Harlem after-hours clubs of the early 1940s, was not simply a new style, it was a position. It stated, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that the function of jazz was not to entertain, not to produce something pleasing for a dancing audience, not to communicate warmth and accessibility to the broadest possible public, but to explore the formal possibilities of the music with the seriousness and the difficulty that a genuine art form required. By this definition, what came before bebop was not wrong, but was incomplete. A foundation, necessary, worthy of respect, but not the destination. The implicit critique of Armstrong in this formulation was never far from the surface. Armstrong was the most celebrated figure in pre-bebop jazz, the performer who had, more than any other, shaped what jazz was and what it could do. He was also, by the 1940s, the performer whose public persona most clearly embodied what the bebop generation was positioning itself against. The broad smile, the warmth directed outward at whatever audience was present, the quality of accessibility that made Armstrong's music reachable by people who knew nothing about jazz. These were the things the new generation found problematic. Not the music itself, exactly, but what the music was willing to do for an audience, and how visibly it was willing to do it. Gillespie's own public statements about Armstrong during this period were rarely direct confrontations. He was too sophisticated a musician and too shrewd a public figure to make simple dismissals of someone whose technical achievements he understood as well as anyone. But the general direction of his position was legible. Armstrong belonged to one chapter, bebop belonged to the next, and the musicians who wanted to be taken seriously as artists rather than as entertainers understood which chapter they were in. Gillespie was in the next one. This was what he believed. It was also, by the standards of 1950, a reasonable belief to hold. What it missed, what the formulation missed, not through ignorance, but through a kind of necessary incompleteness that all manifestos share, was something that couldn't be accounted for in the theoretical argument. Something that was in the room when Armstrong played. Something that the category of entertainment didn't capture, and that the category of art didn't quite capture either. Gillespie had not been in that room recently. He had heard the records. He had his position. Then, one night in the mid-1950s, he went to see Armstrong play. Armstrong played. The room did what rooms did when Armstrong played. It oriented itself around the music in the way that rooms orient themselves around things that are genuinely happening. The people at the other tables fell into the particular quiet of people who have stopped managing their evening and started receiving it instead. The musicians in the All-Stars followed the way they always followed Armstrong, with the sensitivity of players who have been alongside someone long enough to feel the music before it arrives. And Gillespie sat in his chair, very still, and listened. Those who were with him that evening said that the stillness continued throughout the performance and for some time afterward. That when the set ended and the ordinary noise of the club resumed, and Gillespie was asked by whoever was at his table what he thought. His response was not the kind of response he usually gave to music he had just heard. He usually had things to say, precise things, specific things. The particular phrases Armstrong had played, the choices the All-Stars had made, the ways the performance compared to what he knew of Armstrong's recording work. That evening he said something brief. The accounts differ on the exact words. Some say it was a statement about Armstrong's relationship to the trumpet. Some say it was something about the quality of what had been in the room. Some say it was almost nothing, a few words and then a return to silence. What the accounts agree on is the brevity and the quality of it, that whatever Gillespie said was said by someone who had just been made aware of something he had not fully known before, and who was still in the process of adjusting. The adjustment for Gillespie was not a reversal of his position on what bebop was or what it had been trying to do. He did not stop believing in the musical project he had spent his career building. What he revised, gradually, and in the years following that evening, was the part of the argument that had placed Armstrong squarely in the category of what had been superseded. The thing he had heard in the room that evening was not the thing the argument had been arguing about. It was something older and simpler, and less susceptible to generational supersession than the argument had room for. It was the specific quality of a musician who had found, completely, the thing he was supposed to find, who had settled into the center of himself so fully that the question of whether what he was doing was modern or old-fashioned became, in the room where he was doing it, simply the wrong question. By the mid-1950s, Armstrong and the bebop generation had been in something like parallel existence for the better part of a decade, aware of each other, influential on each other in ways that neither side always acknowledged, occupying different positions in the jazz world without much direct engagement. Armstrong continued touring with his All-Stars. Gillespie continued leading small groups and occasional big bands, recording, influencing a generation of musicians who had absorbed bebop the way Armstrong's generation had absorbed New Orleans. The professional distance between them was not, on either side, hostile. It was more like the distance between two people who understand each other's work better than they are given credit for, and who have, for reasons that are partly strategic and partly genuine, settled into positions that don't require much direct engagement. Gillespie went to hear Armstrong play without announcement and without the occasion being organized as a formal musical encounter. He was in the same city, Armstrong was performing, and Gillespie went. Those who were with him that evening describe it as a low-key decision, not a pilgrimage, not a significant gesture, simply the decision of a musician with an evening free to go and hear someone play. He arrived at the club in the way that musicians arrive at clubs where other musicians are performing, with a professional's attention, a sophisticated listener's expectations, and the particular awareness of someone who knows enough about the music to hear things that a non-musician listener wouldn't catch. What he heard is something that the accounts of those who were there can describe only in the general terms that come from observing someone else's internal experience from the outside. They say that Gillespie became unusually still during the performance, that the animated, articulate quality that those who knew him described as his resting state was replaced, as the music went on, by something quieter. Not boredom, not critical attention of the kind that produces a running commentary of evaluation. Something more interior, more like the quality of listening that happens when you are hearing something you hadn't expected and don't yet have a category for. What Armstrong was doing that evening, in a small club, with his All-Stars, playing the music he had been playing for 30 years, was what Armstrong always did, playing completely, from the center of himself outward, in a way that had not diminished with the years, but had, if anything, become more direct. His technical range had changed. His energy operated differently than it had at 35. But the fundamental quality of what he produced when he played, the directness, the warmth, the sense that the music was going from him to whoever was listening without any intermediate distance, was fully present. Gillespie heard it. Not for the first time, he had heard Armstrong on records, had been aware of Armstrong's work for his entire musical life. But there is a difference between knowing something and being in the room where it is happening. And Gillespie was in the room. In the years that followed, Gillespie's public statements about Armstrong underwent a shift that those who followed both careers noticed. He had always acknowledged Armstrong's historical importance, the standard courtesy of a musician speaking about a predecessor whose place in history was beyond serious dispute. What changed was the quality of the acknowledgement. It became more personal, more specific, more marked by the particular kind of attention that people give to things they have encountered directly rather than known about from a distance. He said, in various interviews across the late 1950s and into the 1960s, things about Armstrong that were different in character from the respectful historical category of statement. He said that Armstrong was the most complete musician he had ever heard. He said that when Armstrong played, the distinction between what the trumpet was doing and what the music meant collapsed in a way that he had never heard anyone else achieve. He said that the warmth in Armstrong's playing was not a concession to an audience, but was the music itself. That the generosity and the accessibility were not compromises of the art, but were the art, and that he had been wrong to place them in a separate category. These statements were, for those who had been following the Bebop argument's implicit critique of Armstrong's performance style, significant. They represented not a capitulation, but a refinement, the acknowledgement that the original argument, while not wrong in what it was trying to do, had been incomplete in what it was willing to see. What Gillespie had heard in that small club on that particular evening had filled in something the argument had left blank. He didn't describe the evening directly in these interviews, didn't say explicitly that a specific night had changed his understanding. But those who knew him well said the shift dated from approximately that period, and that the quality of his subsequent admiration for Armstrong was different from the respectful acknowledgement that had preceded it. What the evening revealed about the relationship between the bebop revolution and what it was revolutionizing against is something that jazz historians have returned to with sustained attention. The argument Bebop made about seriousness, about artistic ambition, about the relationship between the musician and the audience, was a necessary argument. It did things for the music that needed doing. What it could not fully account for, and what Gillespie understood more clearly after that night in the club, was the particular kind of achievement that Armstrong represented. Not a lesser version of what Bebop was reaching for, but a different and equally demanding thing. The complete inhabitation of a musical self, arrived at through 50 years of playing, that produced in a room full of people a quality of connection that no amount of technical complexity could replicate by itself. Dizzy Gillespie said Louis Armstrong was the past. Then he went to a small club one evening and sat very still for the length of a performance. Afterward, he said something brief that everyone who heard it remembered. He said that Armstrong made the trumpet sound like the most natural thing in the world. He said that was harder than anything Bebop had ever tried to do. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things, but he was most right about that.